All right, we still have some people filtering in. So I'm going to wait. Let's say we'll start in 30 seconds, okay? I want there to be a little bit of a settled sense before we jump in.
Is that Lorraine with you, Rabbi? Well, now you're muted, Rabbi, so we can't hear you at all.
Okay. Good evening. We're going to start. I want to thank Jemmy for her help in getting this together and the whole staff for getting word out about this. We had about 35 people registered, and right now there are about 25, 26 folks on here. And so I'm sure people will filter in as we go. I wanted to just take a brief moment to tell you the origins of this, why we're having this gathering and why now. Part of it, I guess the reason for having the gathering is obvious. And over the last couple of weeks, a couple of folks asked me to create a space for this. In fact, Lenny, I'm looking right at Lenny, who's on my screen. Lenny Rand, during a Torah study, had said that this was just something he really felt like the community needed a space to reflect and to talk, and I couldn't disagree. There was part of me that had wanted to do this immediately when the conflict began. The conflict in Israel began, but my own thoughts were so muddled and my own emotions so intense that I wasn't really ready to have any kind of constructive conversation. So, thank God right now, things are there's a relative calm that's settled over Israel. I don't think anybody here on this call is so naive as to think that that's any kind of there's any kind of peace. We shouldn't be overconfident or um, over optimistic about what it signifies. But we'll take the calm where we can get it. And so thank God we're having this conversation at a time when there's relative stability. Everyone could use an alternate, so it would be helpful if we could just be stable. And what I think is that what I wanted to do is to just reflect on this moment and then tell you what we're going to do tonight. So I just want to name first and foremost that this is a really painful time. In spite of the relative stability that I said, this has been for all of us just an incredibly difficult time for American Jews. And for right now, I'm speaking as a leader in the Jewish community, and we'll talk about the broader world. But I just want to say that for Jews all over the world, most obviously for Israelis, but for our brothers and sisters throughout the whole world, this has just been an agonizing time. The terrifying vision of just nonstop missiles flying over Israeli cities, and the knowledge that that people are, having to be in bomb shelters because an organization committed to the destruction of Israel, to the literal destruction of Israel, is targeting civilians. Not that civilians in Israel are collateral, targets, but that literally Hamas, which violates every principle of international law, and has no interest in a just war, which is the guiding principle that allows people to think through how nations have to fight wars when they're dragged into it. But Hamas is literally committed to unjust wars. That is, civilians are their primary targets. Watching that on the news and hearing from friends and relatives and people we know in Israel who are terrified. And by the way, the victims of the violence in Israel are not. This is not just a Jewish thing, right? We all know that there are citizens of Israel who are not Jewish who are also terrorized and victimized by missiles that fly in from Hamas. Kids in bomb shelters, and then the mobs in the streets where Jews were attacked, and then our hearts, maybe if it's possible, break even more with the sight of Jewish mobs incited by anxiety, fear, and violence attacking innocent Arabs, which is, one of the most disgusting sights that I've ever seen in my life. What everything you've seen and we have seen together has broken our hearts. In addition to that, and wrapped up with it, is the reality, the explosion of anti-Semitic events and anti-Semitic incidents, the attacks on Jewish bodies, and Jewish security and Jewish safety, people being attacked simply because they are Jews. And the equation of Israel with Jewish citizenry, wherever people might be, just blatant anti-Semitic slogans being shouted and attacks. And, unfortunately, we can't say this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. Who would have thought that we would have anti-Semitism in 21st century America or Europe, right? We know, and we've been forced to see again and again over the last years, that that anti-Semitism is something that's just under the surface sometimes. And I'll say that as a Jew in the United States, I live and consider myself to live in relative security. I don't walk around scared, and I don't think that you should walk around scared. It's not the defining characteristic of what it means to be a Jew right now. But hate is hate, and it's deeply unsettling and unnerving. I send my kids to a Jewish school, so I certainly think about what that means for their safety. And it's repulsive that those who criticize Israel, some of those who criticize Israel, can't make a distinction between Jewishness and certain policies of the Jewish state that they might find objectionable, and that tells more about them than they're perhaps willing to reveal. And one last bit on what's so difficult about this time, and then I want to move on to what I think our response has to be. Some of the criticisms of Israel are to be taken seriously, as I hope to talk about a little bit later. And some of you have heard me make criticisms of the Israeli government, so that's not something that I shy away from, and I don't think Israel or the government is ever above reproach. But some of the outrageous, uninformed, and criticisms of Israel are extremely difficult to stomach, especially when they're coming from people who are friends, either political allies or people with whom we might have other relationships. The equation of Israel with some of the worst offending states that are the worst offenders of human rights is shallow and offensive and painful and disappointing, and also the disproportionality of criticism of Israel. And I always like to avoid sounding like I'm reciting talking points, but just to say something that you've heard 1,000 times because it bears repeating, because it's important. When Israel is the only country that's being criticized in a region that is home to theocratic regimes that are hostile to women where feminism is effectively illegal, where gay and lesbian men and women are at risk for their lives if they say who they are, and if they're open about what their identity is. These Some of these regimes, which are directly opposed to the greatest achievements of modern democracy and of universal values and of human rights and of human dignity, everything that people who care about liberal values should abhor. So many people are silent about the regional powers who have literally have blood on their hands, and Israel stands out for special criticism. So all of that is incredibly difficult to take and very difficult to stomach, and most important, hard to know how to respond to. I'm not going to answer all of that. I don't have the answers, to be sure, but I do want us to reflect on it. And what I want to say, and I want to hear from you in a moment, so this is not going to be a whole night of me talking. But what I want to say is that our response to everything that's going on has to be one of hope, of unity, and of truth. And I mean that quite sincerely. Those are kind of throwaway words very often, but I want to talk about why I think what I mean by that, and why I believe those things are essential: hope, unity, and truth. And that's why I wanted to gather us tonight, is to shore up our connection to those values and reestablish our belief in them. And because I think that that's what matters most. To be sure, nothing that happens in this conversation tonight is going to make or break what happens in Israel, right? I believe what our being informed about Israel matters. But if we're being realistic, if we're being honest, when you have that outraged debate on Facebook with your friend, the future of Israel is not at stake. However, the debates matter a lot, because what happens among the Jewish people and how we carry ourselves in public matter a lot. That has a real impact, and that's what I want us to think about. Okay? So why do I say hope? Well, hope is the opposite of fear. One might say that courage is the opposite of fear, but I think for what matters right now, hope is the opposite of fear. And if we have fear, we are going to fall into despair, and we're going to abandon our values. That's what happens when human beings are in a state of fear. They do anything they can to get out of the fear, and anything is justified when they're in a state of fear. And as for Jewish people, for whom a moral foundation is not just a political value, but a religious one. That is, it's an ultimate value that goes all the way down. Falling prey to fear is essentially annihilating. If we fall prey to fear and we abandon our values, we've surrendered everything that we have and that's precious to us. And so we have to find a way to discover hope. When we have hope, then we can stand in a place of our values. We can hold on to our values, and therefore we can envision the kind of future that we want. Okay? So when we hold on to our values, we can envision the kind of future that we want. And I want to just mention two little, I want to mention one moment that signals the kind of hope that I think we have a right to and that we have an obligation to hold on to. So the first thing to say is, we look at Israel and we survey the last several decades and we feel hopelessness. A friend of mine reminded me the other day, we are the people of the impossible coming true. We're the people, and Israel is the nation of Im Tirtzu, right? If you will it, it is no dream, or it is no legend, as you may have heard it translated. Israel, the state of Israel, and the people Israel have time and again made beautiful blessings come out of nothingness and despair. So no one may tell us, and we may not tell ourselves, that we have any right to despair, because time and again we have done the impossible. And we can point to the stories of our modern history to demonstrate. The mere creation of the state of Israel was a miracle that happened against all odds, that never should have happened according to what was reasonable. So I want us to keep that in mind. There's always room for hope. Just before I got on tonight, I saw a beautiful story that's actually from February that you may have seen, which is a lovely, magnificent, lovely is the wrong word, it's too delicate a word, a magnificent, gorgeous image that I want you to hold in your mind. And that is back in February, there was a Chabad, I think he was maybe a rabbi or just a Chabadnik who was at a hospital in Israel. His name was Shlomo Galster. And he was deathly ill with COVID in an Israeli hospital. And his family wasn't there either because, I don't know if they were out of the country or they couldn't visit him because of COVID. And he was totally alone, dying in a hospital bed. And he had an Arab nurse named Ibrahim Maher. And Ibrahim knew nothing about this, obviously knew nothing about the Jewish religion, but he had come to know this patient a little bit, and he knew that this was a religious man. And he knew that there were these two words, Shema Yisrael. And, assuming he's fluent in Arabic, he must have known what they meant. He didn't know the whole line, but he knew that Shema Yisrael was important and that this was a deathbed ritual. And he recited the Shema with Shlomo. These two men separated in every way, by religion, by culture, probably by the neighborhood, certainly by the neighborhood where they lived, by their national identity. I'm going to go ahead and imagine divided by their politics. But there was this moment of dignity and beauty and decency where they both understood that they were simply human beings. And at that level, everything stripped away except the compassion, love, and empathy. And Ibrahim recited the Shema so that Shlomo would be able to die with the sound of the Shema ringing in his ears. And indeed, Shlomo's family showed up after he died, and they very beautifully expressed their gratitude to this Arab Israeli who had had the decency and the dignity to make sure that this man died with dignity. So, of course, it's just a moment, and the cynical parts of our brain says, well, it's a lovely story, but you can't really multiply that across a whole population. Everything our conscious mind does to tear away at hope. But I want us just to hold that image in mind, because it's a reminder that Israel, like every other place on earth, is filled with human beings. And when we can get away from the fear and when we can have actual encounters, anything is possible. So I use that image not to make any argument, but just to frame, to insert it into our conversation and into our hearts, and to help frame the discussion so we don't lose hope. And so I said hope, and I said unity. So if hope allows us to have to be able to envision the future we want, unity allows us to build the future that we want. And the Jewish people are so divided when it comes to Israel, and we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that. We're going to learn a little bit tonight, very briefly. We're going to learn some texts that talk about the meaning of disagreeing in a way that affirms humanity. And it's essential. That's a real task we can accomplish. You can accomplish this tonight. You can accomplish this in the next conversation you have on Israel or any other topic. This is a positive obligation we have in disagreeing with another to affirm unity. We must not contribute to the cheapening of ideas and to the destruction of one another by the way we talk about Israel or any other topic. It's spiritually damaging and practically devastating. practically, politically devastating to the Jewish people and to Israel if the Jewish community continues to marginalize those who disagree with them. That's a real accomplishment that is within your hands right now. And I want to say that that kind of unity is essential. So hope, unity, and the truth. The truth has to do with how we think through and talk through about Israel. And I want to let that speak for itself over the course of the evening. The truth is something that no one of us has, but it's our obligation as we think about Israel to be honest, whether we're on the political left, the political right, or the political center, not to choose facts or ideas or opinions that are convenient or that are tribally significant, but to be a people of interested in truth. Because if we don't have that, we don't have anything. So hope, unity, truth. If we cling to those, we'll make it through and we'll come out whole and will be a blessing to the world, which is what we're obligated to do. So for the rest of the evening, what I want to do is I want to have some time just to share a little bit. I want to invite, probably not enough time for us all to share, but I want to ask you a specific question, which I'll return to in a moment. So we're going to share a little bit. We're going to learn a little bit. And then I want to share some thoughts about Israel and about what it means to be a Jew in this moment. And then I want to offer a prayer. So that's the hope for tonight. That's the agenda. So first, I want to open it up a little bit and ask you this question: how have you been these last 2 weeks? How have you experienced the last 2 weeks? What emotions have gone through you? What have the last 2 weeks, or I don't know the exact time from the moment of the conflict unfolded? I just want to invite a couple people who will share what it's been like to be a Jewish American at this moment with everything that's happened since the conflict began. So you can just raise your hand, and if you're willing to share, I'll call on you. Many of you have heard me say that I used to be a high school teacher, so I'm very, very comfortable with awkward silences. More than that, I thrive on them. Okay, Abby Layton. Nice and loud, Abby.
Okay. Here, just a minute. Oops. Okay. I've been really frightened and really feeling alone. I'm certainly turned to my Jewish community, but I'm one of those people that has identified with the left and human rights work all my life. And I'm just in shock about the reactions of my friends who are also on the left. I'm heartbroken, I'm disgusted, I listened to the ADL presentation today, and antisemitic incidences have gone up by 80% in the last 2 weeks, was what they said. I've worked against the radical right and white supremacy and white nationalism all my adult life, and I expect this sort of thing from people who are really hateful, but I'm shocked at the reaction of my friends and the dead endness of any kind of conversations that I try and have with them.
Thank you. Yeah, fear, and it's interesting because I said at the beginning, none of us are shocked by the anti-Semitism, but in fact, the scale of it, the explosion of it, it is shocking.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, go ahead. My mom wants to share a thought.
Oh, whoops. Before I came to America, I worked for the Israeli government at the embassy with the military attaché. And so I am so pro-Israel. And when we went to Israel in 1967, before Josh was born, all I wanted to do was stay there and have my children be in the army and defend. And it is so upsetting to see what is going on in the destruction. And I do have some very close friends there, and what they are saying and what they are stunned about is that the Israeli Arabs, who they thought were their such good friends and neighbors, they would go over there for coffee and everything was very, very nice. They are now throwing stones at their cars. It is so hostile. The Israeli Arabs, who are citizens, but their first affiliation is as Muslims, and therefore they want nothing to do with the Jews, the Israelis. And the other thing is that the Israelis feel that they have a right to everything they're doing, taking the land. And I have to say, as far as Netanyahu goes, whom I so admired so many years ago, I think it was he who ordered the soldiers to go into the mosque the night before Ramadan and tell some of the Palestinians out. You can either leave nicely or we're going to just get rid of your houses. And this is what the Americans and the British and throughout the world are hearing. And listening to OPB yesterday, the sympathy for the Muslims, either in America with their relatives, they're feeling guilt and crying. It was so heartrending to hear about that. And then my question is, what are we doing? How is this going to end? And was it right to invade a mosque, not their house of worship, until some Palestinians to leave or their houses are going to be taken, and also that Israel has a right to this land. And I think for me, whose heart is in Israel, it's so hard to defend some of the stuff that is going on, and it is shocking and it's very, very upsetting. Somebody as emotional about Israel as I am. So, how do you defend some of the stuff? They are not equal citizens. They don't have equal rights. And having lived in England and then here, everybody theoretically before the past president was here had equal rights. They don't have equal rights, and it's a very difficult thing for me emotionally to defend.
Thank you. It is, yeah. So conflicting emotions and ideas. Anybody else? Thanks, Mom. Anybody else want to share how the last couple of weeks have been for them in terms of how they're feeling and just what it's been like? Maybe one or two other voices. Let's see, Cheryl. I see Cheryl. Saw Cheryl. Where do you go?
Let's see. Mostly, I have just been shut down about what's going on. And I'm really grateful for this tonight because it feels like a little place for opening up a bit. I feel like, I've been in this, let alone what goes on in the outside world, I'm just in this awful argument with myself about Israel and Palestine, and have been for a long time. And it's kind of like when I think of, if I talk to anybody, it doesn't matter what side they think they're on, I get angry at everybody, no matter what side or what they say. It's like everybody's wrong.
That's right.
And I'm really, I think in the moment that we're in the United States, where we're really examining our history, I kind of feel like the story of Israel that I grew up with, like sort of Exodus, I guess would be the prime example. It's like, I look at that now and I say, well, that's like George Washington saying, I never said a lie.
Mhm.
Abraham Lincoln
Well,
was most
meaning that
concerned about the
it's
slaves.
mythological,
Say
meaning
that
that it's a
again?
myth,
Yeah,
meaning that it's mythological. Yeah.
right. So it's kind of, moving from that myth to, as close as we can get to reality. To me, it's just like the reality is just ugly.
Yeah.
And it is very hard to feel hope, although there are times when I manage to do that.
Yes. Well,
And
sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, so I am troubled and have been for a very long time about the human rights abuses in Israel.
Mhm.
And to me, that makes it, that's part of, this horrible conflict inside myself.
Yes.
And I just want to say, because I have a chance to say it, I am so tired of people using the word conflict for whatever it is that's going on.
Right.
It's just like, it's such a whitewashing word.
Right. It's like one notch more intense than disagreement. Doesn't capture what's at stake here.
It's just, it drives me nuts.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me. So I think you probably speak for many people, not necessarily everybody. I want to make space for everybody on this call. You deeply conflicted, and I'm the same way, and I have arguments with people on the left and the right, and I know very well. So thank you for sharing that. One more, I'm going to call in Fern, but I just want to underscore one other thing, which thus far everybody's been awesome. And I know you know this, but it wasn't by accident that I introduced hope and unity before we did this, right? So wherever we come from politically, and I'll take a couple more comments, just remember that, there's so much at stake for all of us. Like as Cheryl was just saying, when we are attached to a particular story about Israel, that's not just an abstract set of facts, a particular narrative. That it means a lot to us. So I have on my table in my office, on my desk in my office, I have a picture of the 1967 Life magazine that has a picture of the Israeli soldier on it. And I have that because it was an unbelievable moment. And that story is not just a story of the Jewish people. It's not just a story, 1967, of what Israel was able to accomplish and fighting out of this victim position. It's also, as my mother alluded to, a story of my family. I wasn't born, but my mom chose to be in Israel. My sisters were in Israel in 1967. So
we chose, let me just say this.
Let me just finish my point. It's very important. That when what I want to say to you is that whether you're disagreeing with somebody from the left or from the right, that this goes very, very deep for all of us. Okay. And I want us just to appreciate that. Can you just call in?
I just wanted to say that we did stay in 67. And I remember saying to my husband, my children are here. Everybody I love is here. I'm not leaving.
Yeah.
And our parents begged us to leave, and we didn't.
Yeah.
And we was able to give blood and be very much a part of Israel. And I am devastated about what is going on. I'm just sick that my husband isn't here to talk about it. Josh wants me to shut up. So.
Well, I don't want you to shut up. I want to make sure that other people have a chance to speak. That's how I would frame it. So you can see it means, it's part of our family, part of our lore, and part of who we are. So go ahead, Fern.
Well, I will say that I originally did not intend to say anything tonight, and I was only going to listen. But since you threw it open, I want to give another vantage point. I am the child of 2 Holocaust survivors. And I will see things through a different lens, as each of us sees things based on the lens that we come from. A few of you know I was part of the executive committee that built the Holocaust Memorial and spent 10 years of my life doing that. I'm also past chair of the U.S. Holocaust and War Victims Tracing Center for American Red Cross. So I dealt internationally with a lot of parts. I've been part of the JDC board and also Oregon Holocaust Resource Center. So I have dealt, a portion of my life has dealt with this. And I look at history in a different perspective. First of all, I'm much more moderate. I believe in compromise, but I don't look at 20-second sound bites. And that is what the world is looking at right now. So I look at it from a different perspective of where we were in 1930s and how Jews were being treated, and the country of Germany intellectually being the top country in the world, not unlike what people respect the United States today. And now I look at where we are, and I have said for years and decades that we have to be very careful as Jews, because how we are treated will flip on a dime. And unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, that's what I have seen. I have seen people not understanding. I remember in 1973, since you brought up 67, even though I only admit to being 40, the reality is how proud as young Jews were we could finally admit in public to being Jewish after the Yom Kippur War and how Israel won it. And what I think that we need to do as a Jewish community, because we know that if there are 20 of us in a room, there's at least 21 different opinions. That's what makes us who we are. But what we need to look at is a whole picture. Israel is 70 years old. Where it has come from then until now, what it has accomplished in 70 years, compare that to every other country in the world. It is absolutely not perfect. It is amazing, however, and what it has been able to do in such a short period of time. What I have found the worst in the last few weeks is that people did not recognize until some of the things I heard today from ADL, as well as Fox News 2 days ago when they were doing commentary. People did not recognize the impact of Hamas's rockets. They didn't even acknowledge Israel's right to protect itself and to see this imbalance, because we live by a double standard in the world, that Israel has to be much higher and much different than even the expectations for the United States or for any other country in the world. I do not think Israel's perfect. I happen to think, however, that if things continue here, it's probably the one country I'd consider living in as a Jew to feel safe. And I think that that's what we need to look at when we look at this entire picture, that this time right now in the United States is not all that different 1930s in Germany. And it also came after a pandemic, also came after economic crisis. And I think that we need to understand where we are, how vulnerable we are. And I think one of the most disappointing elements to date is that I happen to believe in the concept of BLM and the mantra of it. The first paragraph in their platform is great, and everything else is so hateful as I read it. So anti-white, so anti-Israel, so anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, that none of us as minorities should ever be picking on the other, that we have to understand that unity and strength goes in all kinds of other directions. And so although I have fought for social justice and human rights all my life, also, I believe that there are many other parts to the story. And when, yes, Lorraine, I agree with you that trying to evict someone is a little bit challenging, but we don't know the entire story. And we don't know that those are squatters in land that is owned by landlords that just would like to have their rent paid. I'm done. Anyway, that's kind of where I think we need to look at.
Right. Thank you, Fern, and also for making space that, we know that we can say we have reservations and still be enormously proud about Israel. So thank you for naming that. Okay, I'm going to take two more comments. I want to ask people to keep them to about 90 seconds. And I'm going to call on Jonathan Lander and then Sarah Sturtz.
I only want to say.
Yeah, I keep telling myself, and I've mentioned to other people, you got to separate Judaism, the religion, from the politics. But then I realize you can't. That said, what I find terrifying and galling is, with regards to the whole Black Lives Matter movement, is that there will never be a Jewish Lives Matter movement, regardless what happens. There could be synagogue bombings, there could be attacks on Jews. Nobody is ever going to protect us. And I think that's super terrifying and has me actually considering, leaving this country, either to Israel or elsewhere. The hypocrisy of this country is really terrifying.
Yeah.
That, we could rise up and, come to the defense of Blacks as we should. But what I realize now is nobody will defend Jews. We're the most hated people on earth, and we will continue to be the most hated people.
Well, so thank you, and thank you for being honest about, and sharing your vulnerability about your fear, and you're not alone in that reaction, and as Abby started us off talking about that. So thank you for naming that. Insisting though on the hope, I do want to say the name of Eric Ward, and I could name many, there are certainly others, but Eric Ward is a name some of you know only because he's in our Portland community, the head of the Western State Center, African American, wonderful guy, beautiful activist, beautiful human being. He's not Jewish, but he says that we can't fight racism until we fight anti-Semitism. So there are voices, there are allies. But I hear you, Jonathan. Okay, last comment by Sarah, and then we're going to pivot. Sarah Sturtz.
Thank you. You had started this after your remarks. You had started by saying, how have we been feeling the last few weeks? And the only observation I want to make, and I don't know whether it's coming on the heels of a pandemic, following 4 years of an administration that I hated. Not everybody would agree, but I felt the angst for 4 years. I felt it before. I continue to feel it now. Throw in a pandemic just for some double whammy, and it's been an anxiety-producing situation. Now we are faced with what Israel's going through and asked to make comments on it. And the only thing I'm thinking of right now is, where is Marshall McLuhan when you need him? Because I don't know what to believe. I follow the news. It's biased. I look at newspapers, they're biased. I listen to radio programs. Everybody has an opinion. How do I know what the truth is? Well, you might say, watch this, read this. My husband might say, watch this, read that. And yet everyone who talks has the slant that is the truth. And I don't believe that either. Now, is that a function of what happened over the last few years? I have no idea, but I can only tell you, Rabbi, that I feel damaged.
Yeah.
I feel damaged. I don't know how to find. When I hear a story, with all due respect, I doubt it.
Yeah.
I doubt what's the veracity, who saw it, who heard it, what really happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. That's so heartfelt and so real. And as I said to Jonathan, you're not alone in that either. I think there's a suspicion and a question about what is the truth. But there too, that's deeply Jewish. I think a wonderful Jewish reaction to any well thought out opinion is, right? So whatever it is, there's always another view. And I just remind you that Jews, after all these thousands of years, we can't even agree on what the first pasuk of the Torah says. right? Like literally, if you open a Mikraot Gedolot, which is a copy of the Torah in Hebrew that has all of the traditional medieval commentaries, I kid you not, if you open one of those, you see the first 4 words of the Torah, and then you see about 10 pages of commentary about people disagreeing about what it says. So what I would say is, while we want to be committed to trying to understand the truth, and I do believe that's important, there are some issues that are so complex that I think we can be comfortable saying that we've never, in fact, we should be uncomfortable if we ever think we've arrived at the final truth. And I would say that our goal, certainly with complex political issues, and certainly with something with as much stake as there is in the Israel discussion, should be to find a view that seems to us to be the least uncomfortable, that might be the best that we can do. And I'm glad, I'm going to segue now into a different set of a different direction. But what I want to say now is that we have to educate ourselves wildly. We have to read widely, and that means reading stuff that you hate. And I want to echo what Fern said. It means that you're not going to find, just close your if you want to use Facebook to learn about the Middle East, close your Facebook account. Facebook is for saying hi to friends, for posting silly pictures of cats, and sharing music with friends. Forget about Facebook. Read, guys, you gotta hold on a second, guys. You want to read widely, read in journals, read books that reject your primary assumptions, read magazine articles that do. Read widely and learn to be uncomfortable with facts that you don't like. And if you do that, then you're being profoundly Jewish, and you will educate yourself. And I'm not claiming that I do this. I'm claiming that I try to be committed to doing this. But here, let me share I'm going to switch the agenda around. We're going to close with some learning, but I want to just share my thoughts about what's going on in Israel. These are Rabbi Rose's thoughts. I'm not a political maven. I'm not an expert. I always thought it was very, very strange that congregants insist that their rabbi be a policy expert on something that has to do with how land is used, water rights, international law, ethnic history, cultural history in Israel. So I don't claim to be a maven on this. There are people who know more about Israel and its history than I do. But I want to share my thoughts because I'm your rabbi, and that's what I want to do. So here are my thoughts. Okay.
Can I just say one thing? I know I'm interrupting. I know I'm your mother, and the one thing I believe we are all united in is that there must always be in Israel a refuge for Jews throughout the world. We must have Israel. We must support it.
Okay.
You agree with that?
Okay, I'm going to share my views. So thank you. Good. You done? Anything you want to say?
No.
Okay. Thanks, Ima. So you can see a very, very deep love for Israel in my family. So I want to share my thoughts. I want to say that just to state what has to be stated, Hamas, and I mentioned this at the beginning, Hamas is fundamentally evil. Okay, there can be no compromise about that.
No.
People who are saying online that there's some kind of equivalency between Israel and Hamas. Well, Israel does bad stuff, Hamas does bad stuff. Those are people who simply, I just have to believe, because I don't want to believe that these people are evil, and I don't. I just have to believe that they don't understand. So my thoughts are that Israel is in a conflict, in a relationship with an organization that is inhuman. Hamas is literally committed to the destruction of civilian lives and literally committed to the destruction of Israel as a political entity. So that needs to be understood, and that those who side with Hamas are not taking a radical political position. They're taking a reactionary, horrific political position. and we should, I will not engage in a debate with somebody who does not accept that premise, because it's not an opinion. I mean, you can Google Hamas's charter. So I start with that. Then I go to the fact that Palestinian leadership is bankrupt. Hamas is part of the Palestinian leadership. Abbas has been weakened. And footnote, and I'll get more to this. Abbas has been in part weakened by Israel deliberately and by Hamas, but he's also compromised in his own way. So their leadership is bankrupt. I also want to say that with regard to the conflict, just so I make sure that I frustrate everyone tonight, with regard to I use the phrase conflict habitually, but Cheryl appropriately reminds us that that's not a good word. But with regard to the recent violence, that Israel's response was not always proportionate, and that when Israel's response is not proportionate, and it's certainly something that can be reasonably debated, but when it's not, Jews need to be able to say that without being attacked. And Israel has its own internal mechanisms, by the way, for evaluating its own responses, which is not something that we could expect of any other country in the region. But I do believe that there were moments over the last 2 weeks where we can't just say, well, Hamas is evil and therefore anything is justified. And that is one of the problems with the emotion of fear. And that's why I insist on hope. The emotion of fear allows you to justify anything that you do. And Israel must never become a country that tries to justify anything it does. And we, as lovers of Israel, must never begin with the assumption that anything that Israel does is justified and justifiable.
Right.
Because if we do that, that's avodah zarah. That's avodah zarah. That is idolatry. If you begin with the assumption that a person or a nation necessarily can do no wrong, then you're in the territory of idol worship. And so, and likewise, if you conclude that Israel always does wrong, and that's your starting premise, then you're in similar territory. So I want to say that I think that there were moments when Israel's response was disproportionate. So using the premise that Israel is dealing with an enemy that is fundamentally evil and that doesn't have a legitimate partner in the Palestinian leadership, I want to expand out now to talk about Israel's responsibility. Israel, if we begin evaluating the conflict, I believe, there I did it again, Cheryl, that was just for you. If we begin looking at the violence, and we just start with Hamas's horrific bombarding of civilian population areas, and then we try to make sense of what happened just with that, we're doomed to fail. And very often, I think some people start the analysis there because they think that's just how you do it, and some people do it very deliberately because there are larger questions they don't want to consider. And here I have no illusions that everyone here is going to agree with me, but you know that I'm coming from a place of Ahavat Yisrael, the love of the Jewish people, and the love of the land of Israel. I think that we have to look at the broader context, and Israel has for the last decade plus has not tried to cultivate the ground for peace. I'm not saying that the other side has. Okay, that's a false argument. But Israel, in its exploitation of the settlements and in its approach to the treatment of the civilian life of those who live in Gaza, has created a situation that does not represent the best of Jewish values, and has created a situation, or I should say contributed, let's strike that, has contributed to a situation in which it does not give itself a fair chance for peace. Many people will be horrified at the idea that a rabbi says that. I'm not alone as a rabbi in saying that, but for some people, hearing a rabbi say such things feels to them like an outrage. And I can only say that if we look at Israel through some kind of objective lens, I believe that we have to conclude that. I'm going to circle back to that in a moment, so just bear with me. And I know that folks may disagree with me, and reasonable people could disagree with me strongly, but that this is my view. I believe that Israel has not attempted to always pursue policies that keep the best hope alive for peace. I'm not naive. I'm not an idiot. I know that Israel, as I said at the beginning, that Hamas is not a legitimate partner in peace, but that does not, in my mind, absolve Israel of the moral obligation to try to do the very best to keep the door to peace open and to try to create the best conditions for Arabs in Gaza as possible. And I think its policies and in particular the settlements have made it very grim and have led to a condition in which it's almost impossible for Palestinians to have any hope. And we know, I've already said what happens when people don't have hope. I will say this, that I share the anxiety and the horror that Abby and Jonathan and others gave voice to with regard to anti-Semitism. And in particular, I'm a person of the left. I'm sometimes a person of the wild-eyed left. I'm the stuff of right-wing people's nightmares. And on Israel, though, I'm disgusted. I'm disgusted by how people on the left talk about Israel. There certainly are people on the left who are very wise and who are considered in their criticism, but there are many people who have been infected by the idea that you can express a political opinion in 120 characters or in 30 seconds, and that you don't need to know anything about the history. And their thinking is foolish and therefore on this topic dangerous. And their Jew hatred often comes to the surface. I want to say that sometimes I think that the anti-Semitism is accidental by people who don't really hate Jews, but it's attached to abhorrent opinions that they have not thought through. But there is also malicious anti-Semitism that we're seeing everywhere now, and it's terrifying. We see our own pro-Israel views being silenced on college campuses and in the public square, specifically in left circles, right? If you are a deeply progressive person and you are a Zionist, you are silenced and you are marginalized. It's abhorrent and it's stupid and it's foolish and it's ignorant and it has to stop. And we should feel great courage and summon ourselves to call it when we see it. And we should not be abashed. We shouldn't be afraid to lose friends for speaking the truth. And if we do, then they were not friends. Because I don't want to be part of a liberal society where people have illiberal opinions and tell me that my views are not correct. So having said that, I now want to say that the silencing that happens on the from the left is all too familiar to those Jews on the political left who have been critical of Israel within the Jewish community. Because many of the Jewish institutions that are outraged by the behavior of the left, at the way that the left silences Zionism, themselves have been very willing to silence Jews who have been critical of Israel over the last decade, 20 years, 25 years. How do I know that's true? Because I have experienced it. Jewish institutions, out of their love for Israel, and out of their anxiety about slander against Israel, have repeatedly marginalized rabbis and activists who have had the audacity to criticize Israeli policy in the territories and elsewhere. So nobody who is within major Jewish institutions can stand on moral high ground at this moment when Zionists are being marginalized on the left and say that we must never silence voices, because instead they have to check their own history of the marginalization of these voices. I believe, and I said this going back 20, 25 years ago, that some, not all, some of the young Jewish voices on the left, who I believe are terribly misguided in their unfair criticisms of Israel, are people who might have found a home in the Jewish community if they were not labeled as Israel haters, and if they were not labeled as ignorant and foolish and childish, and as people who hated Israel. That was a fatal mistake that the Jewish institutions continue to make. So, put more positively, what I want to say is that the Jewish leaders, and I consider myself a Jewish leader, and I don't think I've always done magnificently in this regard. Jewish leaders and Jewish institutions must make space for dissenting voices. It's not enough to have an Arab Israeli who has wonderful things to say about the Israeli army. It's not enough to have a college student who once in a while has questions about the Likud party. We have to be aggressive in making space and insisting on unity. We must not silence people who have legitimate moral questions. It has to stop. It's not good for Jewish unity. It's not good for Israel. I've been a victim of it. I resent it. It's painful. And you, as people who support Jewish institutions, I ask you to stand with me in helping there to be a more robust dialogue and making space for voices that are sometimes difficult to hear. Beyond that, I want to say that, I guess on that note, what's so shocking when you open up an Israeli newspaper or you go to an Israeli think tank like the Hartman Institute, for just as one of many examples, you will be shocked to find the range of opinions in Israel. Some people who think that such and such an opinion, maybe something that I just said, is outlandish and is too radical and too far left. You go to an Israeli think tank, a centrist think tank in Israel, or a centrist newspaper, or a centrist newspaper columnist, and you hear them saying the same thing. So what I would love is for us to have the informed, broad debate that takes place within Israel, and to bring that sanity and that thoughtfulness and that love of the discussion to ourselves, to gift ourselves with that broad-mindedness. And then I think in a kind of natural way, the people gravitate towards depth of thought and broad-mindedness. And if we do that, if we can make space for that in our own institutions, in our own communities, then the voices that are shallow and ignorant and oriented towards the soundbite are going to move to the margins. That's what I believe. That's what I believe. And, you could accuse me of being naive, but as I said, hope is a fundamental principle to me. So I believe that we have to do that. And I just want to say that it's not befitting us, who are a people of the book and who are people of books, who are people who are known for their broad-mindedness and their creative thinking and their dialectical skills. For those of us who are on the left, it's not befitting us to shut down arguments of people who have complex thoughts on the right. And if we're people on the right, it's not befitting the glory of our people to shut down arguments from people who are on the left. We're broad-minded. We need to explore and expand our minds and our hearts, and to make space for intellectual audacity, and to make space for unity of the heart. So with that, and knowing that I've probably infuriated everyone here, I want to turn now, and I want to do some learning together and to close out our evening by focusing on some learning. And the learning I want to do is not on Israel itself, because we're not going to resolve that. Like you, my heart is broken. I'm outraged. I'm hopeful. I love Israel. I love the land of Israel. I love the people of Israel, and I want it to flourish. And I want there to be peace. But we're not going to resolve that tonight. But what we can do is take away something about about how we talk with one another. So, with your permission, I want to lead us through some texts. Okay?
See if anyone else wants to say something.
Okay. Now I know what I'm doing. Okay.
Oh,
Can you see my? Can you see the text I have in front of me?
Yes.
Okay. Let's all take a big breath, and we are learning together. So let's see. I see Pauline Goldstein, who I happen to know has a lovely way of reading. Would you read this first box here, Pauline, in the English? I'll make it a little bit bigger. Will you read that in English where it says every dispute? You're muted though, my dear. You've got to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
There it is. Nice and loud.
Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. But if it is not for the sake of heaven, it is not destined to endure. What is a dispute for the sake of heaven? The dispute of Hillel and Shamai. What is a dispute that was not for the sake of heaven? That of Korach and all of his followers.
Okay, so who can say something about Hillel and Shammai, just very briefly, just at 10,000 foot level? Who were these two characters? Anybody know?
what about this Lenny?
Jimmy, go ahead.
Well, let's see. Hillel gets like all the glory throughout history, and Shammai gets the short end of the stick. Everything
Exactly.
Hillel said was perfect, and Shammai is demonized.
Exactly right. So Hillel and Shammai were two individuals, Rabbi Hillel, the great Rabbi Hillel, and Rabbi Shammai. But when the Mishnah, and this is a passage from the Mishnah, when the Mishnah talks about Hillel and Shammai, it has in mind those two individuals, but also it has in mind the school that developed around each of them. So Rabbi Hillel had a school, like, you know, when we talk about, for example, any public intellectual like Cornel West or Glenn Lowry, like those are people who have their followers, who follow their thought, who agree with them, who see the world like they do. So Hillel and Shammai were big intellectual schools in the early rabbinic era, and as Jemmy indicated, they always disagreed, and Hillel is the one who we follow. Hillel is the one who we follow. The rulings in the Talmud generally follow the rulings of Rabbi Hillel. So as an example, there was a debate about whether on Hanukkah, on the first night of Hanukkah, should we start with 8 candles and then each night of Hanukkah work our way down to 1? Or should we start with 1 and then work our way up to 8? Well, which one do we do?
1 to 8.
If you don't know the answer to this, I have utterly failed as a rabbi. Okay, good. My sister's saying, Melanie's saying it. We start with 1 and we go to 8. Shammai said you start with 8 and you go to 1. Hillel said, no. We start with 1, we go to 8. And so we follow Rabbi Hillel. That's one example. There are many other examples. And so the question was, essentially what the Mishnah is asking is, look, we know there's going to be a machloket, which means disagreement or dispute. We know there's going to be a machloket. But what's a good machloket and what's a bad machloket? What's a good dispute? What's a bad dispute? What's a dispute that's for the sake of heaven? And what's one that is not for the sake of heaven? Hillel and Shammai model the one that is for the sake of heaven. We'll talk more about that in a moment. What is one that is not for the sake of heaven? Korach and his followers. You have to know a little bit something about the Torah to know about Korach. We're not going to go into it in detail, but the upshot is that Korach was debated with Moses and challenged his leadership. But if you read it carefully, as the rabbis did, it's clear that though Korach is making moral arguments, right? He says famously, to Moses, Moses, you're taking all the power for yourself, but everybody in the Jewish people is holy. So why are you taking power? We're all holy. Let them all have power. So on the surface, it looked like he was making heavenly arguments. But if you read it carefully, a picture of Korach emerges as somebody who really wanted power for himself. He was a demagogue who was using convenient arguments to raise up himself and to diminish everybody else. And therefore his was not for the sake of heaven. And so therefore, what is an argument for the sake of heaven? Well, let me ask you, I'll take one or two opinions. No, I'm not asking about your Mishnaic knowledge. I'm asking just what is your kishkas, what does your heart tell you? Harvey.
Okay, so Korach's argument was an argument about self-interest. And I would put it that it's very equal to Bibi Netanyahu's argument. It's all about him. It's all about self-interest. It's all about the accumulation of power for him. The argument between Shammai and Hillel is about how we should be as a people, how we should be to be mentioned.
Okay, so I'm going to put a slight spin on what you said, just for the sake of, I want to keep everyone's heart at a normal pace here. I don't want everyone's face to turn red and have their heart beating fast when we're studying Torah. So, what I want to say is, if one could establish that Bibi's interest was his self-interest, then we would say Bibi's arguments are not L'Shem Shemaim. Bibi's arguments are for self-aggrandizement, right? If we could establish that. And clearly you believe that Bibi is not out for the good of Israel or the Jewish people, that his primary value is his self-aggrandizement. And therefore that's how you see it. Okay, exactly. So L'Shem Shemaim, an argument L'Shem Shemaim would be something that is for some larger cause, for the larger good. And, this is not something that's so abstract. How often have you found yourself in a debate with somebody, and I'll speak for myself, a debate on Facebook, and I'm suffering under the illusion that I'm arguing for the righteous truth, but a couple of sarcastic posts in, it becomes clear that I'm really arguing so I can sound like, dominant, and like I can sound like the smart one, and I can sound like the one who's more well educated. Then even if I'm on the quote unquote right side, it's not L'Shem Shemaim, because I'm really arguing for me. Okay? So if we keep our arguments for the sake of heaven, for the sake of truth, for the sake of the larger moral purpose, then the dispute itself is good. The dispute itself has so much value that the dispute will endure. It will contribute to some lasting good. It's such a beautiful idea. Look at that line again. It's not about whether the debate will be resolved. This is how beautifully crazy the Jewish people are. And this goes, I think, Sarah Sturtz, to your point, or to your question. It's not that we're trying to arrive at the answer. The Mishnah doesn't say, how do we know which is right? It's when will the dispute endure? It's almost like the rabbis don't want to get the answer. The point is not to end the argument. The point is to create a heavenly debate. Right? To create a space where we can have heavenly disagreements, where I'm not trying to clobber you and have you admit that I'm right. What a shocking and radical take on what it means to have a disagreement, right? We can't resolve it. We're not trying to resolve it. We're trying to create a space for heavenly disagreement. Okay? So that's one idea. So that's from the Mishnah. And now I'm going to take you to a Gemara, to a Talmudic discussion that picks up on the same theme, but adds something to it. Okay, so I told you that the debates always side with Hillel. So now this Talmud is going to ask, why is it? What is so great about Hillel that he always gets to be the guy who has that opinion? Lenny, can I get you to read this Gemara from Eruvin 13b, where it says for 3 years?
For 3 years, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued. One said the halacha is according to our position, and the other said the halacha is according to our position. A heavenly voice spoke. These and those are the words of the living God, and the halacha is according to the house of Hillel. A question was raised. Since the heavenly voice declared, both, both these and those are the words of the living God, why was the halacha established to follow the opinion of Hillel?
Hold on,
It
I'm going to
is,
scroll up. Sorry. Go ahead.
it is,
It is because.
it is because the students of Hillel were kind and gracious. They taught their own ideas as well as the ideas from the students of Shammai. Furthermore, they even taught Shammai's opinions first.
Okay, so first of all, for those who don't know, halakha, halakha means Jewish law. So here it's referring to the decisive opinion. So, for example, the halacha is that we light one candle on the first night of Hanukkah, and then the next candle, and then the next, etc. That's actually the halacha. That's the law. Okay, so it means the law that the rabbis have adjudicated and come to a final decision about. Okay, so that's what halacha means. And so, we have this beautiful idea that sometimes happens in the Gemara, which is that there's this dispute, the rabbis can't find their way about it, and suddenly a heavenly voice here comes down. And I think we as readers are supposed to understand that this was not a hallucination. This really was the divine voice, because these sages were at such a high level that once in a while the divine voice would come down and resolve the debate. And look, it's so wonderful that it doesn't say, hey, Shammai, shut up, Hillel's right. It says, these are both words of the living God. Shammai, you are speaking words of the living God. That is, you are speaking a divine truth. What you're saying is beautiful and true. And Hillel, you also are speaking a beautiful truth. What you are saying is beautiful and true. We're siding with Hillel. Now, the divine voice actually does not explain why. The later rabbis are puzzling over this, saying, well, wait a minute. So if they're both divine, why do we go with Hillel? And so the later rabbis are surmising. They're surmising based on what they know. Well, maybe the reason we went with Hillel is because, do you remember that Hillel and all of his students, when they would get into a debate, do you remember how beautifully they would handle themselves? When they got into a debate and they were explaining why they disagreed with Shammai, they would always tell their students Shammai's argument, and they wouldn't ridicule it. They would actually explain the argument, and they would do justice to it. And so they treated their opponents with dignity, and they took their arguments seriously. And that's why we follow their opinion. Once in a blue moon, you hear somebody do this in a way that's really beautiful. You hear a public intellectual take their opponent's arguments seriously and trot out the arguments not to make fun of them or to belittle them, not to distort them and just to screw them up, but to actually get the ideas out there and then to explain why they disagree with them. If all of us made that a practice when disagreeing with somebody, and again, I'm not wagging my finger here, I'm not pretending I do this, but imagine if in a disagreement with somebody else, you said, okay, hold on, let me make sure I have this right. You're saying, and then what comes out of your lips is not the 5-cent version of what they said, but actually the perfect version of what they said. Imagine that person would say, okay, I'm being taken seriously. And you would have to then see that, well, okay, now that I've laid out their argument, my own argument has to match that. And I'm going to speak as a mensch now. So that's our approach. We're not going to resolve the debate about Israel. And more than that, I'll be really honest with you. Bibi is not waiting to hear the outcome of this Zoom call. He doesn't care. He's not listening, okay? He doesn't care. And I don't mean Bibi just because of Bibi. None of the Israeli politicians, left, right, or center, are waiting to hear what American Jews, how we're like going to think through the situation, okay? That's just not what's at stake. The only thing we can control is to understand that our words have a real impact on Jewish community and on how we represent Jewish values to ourselves and publicly. That is something that counts. We change the world with the way that we talk to one another. We represent Jewish values with the way we present our thinking. And that is something that has a real impact on the world. And that's something that we're trying to take responsibility for tonight. So for the sake of heaven and honoring the thought of your interlocutor, okay? Now, the last thing I want to close with the gorgeous teaching of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, which I had never seen before until I was doing research for tonight. And this one's so beautiful that I'm gonna read this one. I first want to read it in Hebrew just because it's so lovely, and then we'll talk about it. So this is Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. So now we've jumped forward 2,000 years, something like that. Rebbe Nachman of Breslov is the late 18th century. We were trolling around here in the early 2nd century BCE. We leapt forward a couple centuries. Now we're in the 18th century. Rebbe Nachman of Breslov is a magnificent Hasidic thinker. And he said, Moshe hu bichinat hadat, shehu bichinat machlok l'shem Shemayim, v'al ken Moshe hu roshei tevot machloket Shamai Hillel, shem bichinat machloket l'shem Shemayim. Okay, so Moses, and you're going to have to let me go slow here. Moses represents da'at. I love looking out there and seeing some of you looking so carefully at this. I just love the fact that this beautiful community, you guys are Torah studiers. I love it. Okay, Moses represents da'at. Now, da'at in the Jewish tradition is a kind of consciousness, what we might call awareness, a heightened awareness, a heightened consciousness, where he was aware of the whole picture. Even when he was arguing about this or that or focusing on this or that task, Moses was always connected to the whole. That's what da'at is. So Moses, according to Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, represents da'at. He symbolizes this quality. He embodies this quality of unifying consciousness. And that in turn represents a dispute for the sake of heaven. So in other words, what he's saying is what a dispute for the sake of heaven is this unifying consciousness. If you have a disagreement with somebody, and when you're in that disagreement, you're still attached to the sense of unity and of God and the fact that I'm connected to you and you're connected to me, and that the Jewish people have to remain unified and that goodness is in the world. If you hold on to that while you're in a disagreement, you're like embodying Moses's energy. And therefore, the name Moshe in Hebrew, which is Mem Shin Hillel, is an acronym, says Rebbe Nachman, for machloket, which means dispute, which starts with mem, Shamai, which is the house of Shammai, which starts with a shin, and Hillel, which starts with hey. So Moses's name, according to Rebbe Nachman, is actually an acronym for the dispute between Shammai and Hillel, because they represented a dispute for the sake of heaven. So why did I choose that beautiful, beautiful teaching to close with? Because Moshe Rabbeinu, without whom we would have no Torah, without whom we would not have a vision of God, without whom we would not have laws of justice and tzedakah and kashrut, and without whom we would not know how to communicate in a Jewish way with God, without which we wouldn't have any of the mitzvot. According to Rebbe Nachman, what made Moses Moses was that within Moses's Torah was space for everybody, was space for those who make arguments l'shem Shemayim. So if, as we go forward and we talk with our friends within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community, with friends who are on the left and the right and the far left and the far right, if we can ground ourselves in these teachings of Mishnah and Gemara and Rebbe Nachman and remember that our task is not to win the argument, but our task is to embody l'shem Shemayim, for the sake of heaven, in our own research, in our own thinking, in our own connection and discussion with one another. If we can do that, we will be okay. We will be okay. And we will be a blessing in our own small way to the world. I want to, pardon me? Okay, real quick. My sister wants to say something.
I think it was really clear on the Hillel and Shamai that it comes down to simply respecting and hearing and listening to the other people. And if you don't have that, you can't have healthy evolving and learning discussions. If the Israelis and the Palestinians could learn how to do that,
Right.
with it's about respect, and I think we've lost so much of that in day-to-day relationships, in our work, in with everything. That's what it comes down to. Because without that, you have nothing.
It's true. Yasher koach. Yasher koach. A perfect way to end. I want to thank all of you for being here, for hanging in there, for demonstrating the values we talked about. Now, in fairness, we also muted your microphones, so I can only assume that you're honoring the values we talked about. But I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank my mom and my sister, and I want to wish everybody a beautiful evening, and I want to bless all of us with L'Shem Shemayim. My mother's reminding me I didn't do the prayer, so we're going to close with a prayer. Thank you, Ima. One more moment. So,
It was on the screen.
no, you know what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to read this to you. And I want to actually, before we do that, I want to just take 30 seconds. I want you to take a breath. I want you to invite to close your eyes if you want to. You don't have to. And just want you to summon your own prayers for the Jewish people, for all people, and for Medinat Yisrael. Your own silent prayers, send them up to heaven. And then I'm going to close us with a prayer from our tradition. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will. This is from the evening prayers. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom, v'amidenu malkeinu l'chaim, ufros aleinu sukat shlomecha, v'takenenu b'etzat tova milfanecha, v'hoshienu lam'an shemecha, v'hagein ba'adenu. Allow us, Adonai our God, to sleep in peace. Awaken us to life, our sovereign. Spread over us your sukkah of peace. Restore us with your good counsel, and save us for the sake of your name. Shield us. Uvitzel kenafecha tastirenu, ki el shomrenu umatzilenu ata, ki el melech chanun v'rachum ata. Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, for you, God, watch over us and deliver us. For you, God, are sovereign, merciful, and compassionate. Ushmor tzitenu uvoenu l'chaim ul'shalom me'ata v'ad olam. Ensure our going and our coming for life and peace now and forever. May you spread over us your canopy, your sukkah of peace. Blessed are you, Adonai, who spreads the sukkah of peace over us, over all the people Israel, and over Jerusalem. Ufaros aleinu sukkat shlomecha, baruch atah Adonai, hapores sukkat shalom aleinu, ve'al kol amo Yisrael, ve'al Yerushalayim. Amen. Thank you. Laila Tov.
Yasher koach, Rabbi.
Thank you. Laila Tov.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you all for attending. Anybody wants to rewatch the recording will become available on our YouTube archives. Have a good evening. Good Shabbos.